Part 5 of X, There Was a Man, the Saga of Gordon Kahl, A True Story, by Capstan Turner with A.J. Lowry. Page 21, Chapter 3, The League. You can't really understand where Gordon was coming from with his ideas without knowing a bit about North Dakota farmers in bygone days. Ray Sorensen tells us a little bit about this in his diary. He was a young farmer in the Cosby area, engaged to marry another farmer's daughter, Inga. Grain prices were good in 1914, but were disastrously depressed during 1915, when the marriage was to occur. Farmers tried to hold on to their wheat until prices rose again. Inga's family was so concerned with threatened mortgage foreclosure that the wedding was postponed. A banker named Forsyth indeed did foreclose and evict them that year. Ray writes that the capricious banker stole the property. The family moved to town where Inga's father was like a fish out of water and had difficulty making a living. Many farmers had to mortgage their farms to meet expenses. Farmers had more problems than just market price fluctuations. Ray asserts railroad shipment prices were exorbitant. Interest rates were excessive. Short waits often were a fact, and singular local grain buyers depressed prices further to the farmer. Eastern industrialists and bankers were blamed for much of the farmer's plight. On the one hand, farmers would help one another in threshing their grain, sometimes in a race with the falling snow. On the other hand, farmers were stubborn individualists, walking contradictions. Discussion of forming a league during 1915 amounted to little more than talk. The old-timers in Divide County can tell you about all of this. Weather conditions for field work were sometimes harsh. Following a bright display of the aurora borealis, gale winds would often roar southward down the prairie. A person could and still can get lost in a blizzard only a few feet from shelter and freeze to death. Ray saw Inga less frequently after she moved to town. Ray and certain others turned their efforts towards organizing farmers into the league. 40,000 were recruited during 1916. But solicitation was no easy task. Ray once wrestled a farmer to decide whether or not he would join. Ray lost, but declared, "You are the real loser." Ray kept the bargain and didn't bother that farmer anymore. Inga became upset because Ray was forever away on recruitment. Wildwood was the center of the organizing efforts. The newspapers and businessmen were vitriolic in their opposition to the league across the state. Inga opined to Ray, "These people you are fighting don't quit. If you win, you'll be fighting them for the rest of your life." The league put up Frazier as a farmer candidate for governor. On election eve, a blizzard blanketed the state, making movement to the polls difficult for farmers. Early election results indicated Frazier had lost badly. When later returns from rural areas came in, Frazier became governor-elect. Help was months away. However, banker Forsyth foreclosed on Ray, so he and another fellow moved out near the Montana border. Elevators would not accept the grain of certain fomenters. During the next 6 years, the League was of much help in ameliorating the farmers' problems. The problem of buying at retail and selling at wholesale has never been solved. However, Ray wrote, "You struggle for a good life, but you'll never get it." My grandpa, Gordon Kahl, understood all of this too well. Farmers in the 1980s faced similar problems. Grandpa had quit dealing with the local elevator because of being allegedly short-weighted. High interest rates and low grain prices were causing foreclosures, but my grandpa had long ago perceived an additional problem. Under the well-intentioned guise of helping farmers, Uncle Sam was indirectly destroying them with carrot-and-stick techniques. Grandpa Gordon's was a singular voice ignored by others, just like Ray's in early 1915. I'm getting ahead of myself, but the movie Northern Lights made about Ray Sorensen in the late 70s, tells the story. You think they'll make a movie about Gordon Kahl someday? I wonder. It would surely be a lot better than a lot of the yuck I see on TV. Page 23, Chapter 4, Wartime. Joan, that's Grandma, Gordon's wife, told me no giveaway programs existed at the time of World War II started. Her dad worked on WPA project for $40 a month, helping to build a dam south of Heaton. Coffee carried a tin pail was warmed over an open fire for lunch. It was hard work. Everyone around here worked there, except the Kahls. Grandpa's dad was too proud to take anything like that. They, including Gordon, were very independent and self-sustaining people. Grandma Joan had met Grandpa when he was managing the Heaton Lumber Company in 1941. She was in high school living with Margaret Wilson, her older sister, married to Lynn Wilson. Judging from Margaret's accounts, Joan and Gordon became quite fond of each other that year. With December came Pearl Harbor. And Grandpa hinted to Grandma, hinted to Grandma Joan that he had to enlist to help save his country, which saddened Grandma, of course. She says he felt the same way again in 1968 from internal threats and did so until the day he died, trying his best during both periods. He flunked his physical when he tried to enlist. Bad heart, Grandma says. They told him a lot of exercise outdoors and to eat properly and then try again. He asked the draft board to pull his name, and this time he was accepted by the Army Air Corps on February 1st, 1942. Deciding pilot's training would take too long, he volunteered for gunnery training. During basic training, Grandpa Gordon showed a propensity for hitting what he shot at. He was an expert. Tops with the carbine, rhymes with combine, bunching bullseyes at 300 yards. He was one in many thousands who was also expert with a .45 pistol. This weapon was developed during the Spanish-American War to stop charging Filipinos at close range. The barrels in them were loose, not highly accurate. These feats influenced his selection for aerial gunnery school at Harlingen, Texas. He was also trained as a flight engineer and learned to fly at some point, being awarded wings. Grandpa Gordon's talents were immediately applied against the Axis powers as a turret or tail gunner and flight engineer on B-25J bombers. He flew 57 combat missions, 255 combat hours. His base airfields included Kermitali, Moran, Pata, and Finney. This staff sergeant was a hazel-eyed, brown-haired, 139 pounds of flying terror for the enemy. He shot down 10 enemy planes. He was an ace. My grandpa was highly decorated for heroism. He received a Presidential Unit Citation and 9 battle stars, one each for Egypt, Tunisia, Sicily, Balkans, Naples, Rome, Arno, Air Offense Europe, India, Burma, and China. His 4 bronze stars were for Egypt, Libya, Naples, Foggia, Rome, Arno, and Tunisia. He was awarded a Silver Star Medal. He received 2 coveted air medals for coolness and courage under enemy fire. In Burma and China, this is equivalent to the Flying Cross awarded to officers. Finally, he received his 2nd Purple Heart. That last honor was for spilling blood in combat for his country. Enemy shrapnel finally got him after 22 months overseas. He was then returned to the States carrying some of the shrapnel inside him in November 1944. Unknown to the Washington office, the North Dakota Office of the Veterans Administration was later to deny him a military funeral, illegally. However, volunteer veterans from Harvey rendered a military burial anyway. The Washington office later apologized to Joan. After he returned to the U.S., my grandparents were married on January 6, 1945 by a Presbyterian minister. Grandma was a Catholic, but not Grandpa. They wanted to be married by a priest, but Grandpa was told that he must take 6 weeks of instruction. He had only a 3-day delay en route to Santa Ana, California. That incident soured them both on the Catholic Church permanently. Grandma Jones stayed with her oldest sister, Mary Spud, in Minnesota for a while. She then joined my granddad in Greenville, South Carolina in April. He served as a flight instructor there until he was discharged on September the 7th, 1945. She fitted well in their large colonial southern home, which they rented as she could charm the rings off a raccoon's tail. Grandma worked in Greenville as a dental assistant. This was happy time for them, sort of their delayed honeymoon. Upon her arrival, Grandpa Gordon bought an old 36 Ford. Being a good mechanic, he fixed it up. He insisted she learn to drive and to shoot. Then he went to Sears and bought her a 20-gauge double-barrel shotgun. They went out onto White Horse Road, and Grandma learned to drive and to shoot. Grandma was a good conversationalist, but sometimes when she started talking, no one could get a paddle in the water. That gun, which had so much sentimental value to Grandma, was later taken from her. She says it was stolen from the vacant house by the FBI on February the 15th, 1983, part of Yori's gun collection. She and Grandpa hunted extensively during the first 3 years of their marriage. When discharged, they returned to Heaton. Page 26, Chapter 5, Family. I'm just passing on what was told to me. Like I said, Grandpa paid down $1,000 to his Uncle Ned for 160 acres of land a short distance from the Kahl homestead. They lived with his parents over the winter and then bought Ned's little house at auction in April. He then decided to attend college in Fargo, going for a double-E degree that autumn. He quickly became dissatisfied. His English teacher was a communist. They clashed. After a semester, he asked, "When do I start on electrical engineering?" He was told that in his 4th year he would put a steam engine together. At this point, he quit. Grandpa had put a steam engine together when he was 6 years old. At that age, suffering from sinus and hay fever, he was often kept home from school. His dad brought an old steam engine from the granary and put it on cardboard in the living room. Grandpa was slow but a perfectionist in these endeavors at that age. Moving to Bowden from Fargo, Grandpa worked for International Harvester dealer James Kuntz as his mechanic. Linda, my mother, was born there in October 1947. Their Springer Spaniel Clinker had pups about the same time and would run from the puppies to the baby and back to whomever was fussing. She was a good hunting dog, too. The spring of '48 found them back on their little farm. Grandpa decided to try a farm school in Sikeston. He could learn and get paid monthly on the GI Bill, too. Learning that to meet requirements for the school, he'd have to get in debt about $60,000 for dairy barns and such. He came home disgusted. He began to wonder, why such stipulations if the government is trying to help the farmers? He and his dad farmed jointly. Grandpa Gordon signed up for the farm program a few short years. He received a small check for not planting, but he felt he was short-ended. He decided to get out, and the agriculture soil conservation people told him that he could not. He did anyway. So after a couple of years, they told him he could farm as he pleased if he would just only sign his name as a participant. He was the 1% of the country who would not, even for a payment. Since then, he has often chided his neighbors about their welfare checks humorously. He never borrowed or accepted money from the government agencies. After sensing that something was askance in the government, Gordon was curious to know what was wrong. Typically, they farmed during the warm months and traveled to a warmer climate to work for wages during the winters. At first, it was California and then Texas, since it was less congested there. They tried to be self-sufficient as much as possible. He was suspicious of market foods, especially those with chemical additives. Grandpa used mouthwash, but not fluoride dentifrices. Wow. Gordon Kahl did not like fluoride. How about that? Is that a shocking thing or what? They say fluoride makes you docile. I don't think you could call Gordon Kahl docile. Grandpa used mouthwash, but not fluoride dentifrices. His teeth gradually yellowed, even though he never smoked or drank. A big garden and baby chicks in the spring and canning of meat and vegetables during the summer was the rule. Grandma Joan often expressed joy over the years of the peace and tranquility of living in the country. It was so nice, she'd say. A second daughter, Lorna Marlane, arrived on June 7, 1951. Grandpa and Grandma searched for the right church for years. They tried the Congregational Church for a while, where his mother attended, but it supported the World Council of Churches as did his dad. Grandpa rejected some of its teachings. They tried other churches, but Grandpa Gordon's analytical insight caused them to be unacceptable. They became Mormons in 1955, only to resign a few years later. When Gordon learned the close semblance of the temple rituals to those of the Masonic Lodge, which he believed to be satanic, on June 7, 1958, a third daughter came along. For religious guidance, my grandparents depended mostly on the self-study of the Bible, King James Version. Man, I got to read that again. For religious guidance, my grandparents, which is Joan and Gordon Kahl, depended mostly on the self-study of the Bible, King James Version. Man, I knew there was some reason I liked Gordon Kahl. 14 months after Lonnie, Yori was born on August 12th. Was Grandpa Gordon proud? You can't raise a boy with 3 girls, Grandpa Gordon informed their mother, Grandma Joan. So in October of 1960, here came Frederick von Kahl. He attempted to restore the von Kahl family name, but abandoned the idea von was a middle name in America. Gordon was becoming increasingly concerned over political ideas about that time, according to Grandma. He and several others in the area attended meetings in Bismarck, Jamestown, and Minot. He and Grandma Joan joined the Christian Constitution Party a few years later. Long after having concluded that the government no longer acknowledged the Constitution, Clarence S. Martin, M.D., of Medina sponsored the party. Their youngest child, Lorene Marjorie, was born in 1963. The family was always poor financially, but was rich in friends and affection. They were in California when John Kennedy was assassinated. Grandpa Gordon innately surmised hanky-panky. The following summer, they attended a meeting at Fessenden, the county seat for Heaton, where Austin Flett spoke. He was one of the 2 or 3 originators of the tax protest movement. I'm told he was a personal friend of the slain President Kennedy's father, Joe. After Flett's many futile efforts to talk with President Kennedy, Joe finally obtained an appointment for him. They tell me that the late Mr. Flett never filed an income tax return and made speeches denouncing the voluntary tax. During their confab, John told Flett that the higher-ups, wanted him to do something he absolutely refused to do, because it was terrible. John refused to specify just what it was. 3 days earlier, speaking at Columbia University, Kennedy said, "The high office of the president has been used to foment a plot to destroy the American people's freedom. And before I leave office, I must inform the citizen of his plight." 10 days later, John was assassinated, murdered in Dallas. Grandpa had concluded that the federal dollars were being used to destroy us, not to help us. By 1968, Gordon decided he would no longer participate in the IRS system, an evil organization. He would never again file, much less pay to the enemies of Christ. Up to then, he had been paying more income tax than many much larger farms in the area. Some paid no tax. He wrote IRS a letter of discontinuance in 1968 and followed in the footsteps of Austin Flett. All this worried Grandma Joan, who had 4 little children to feed. She knew the problems facing her if he were jailed. My granddad received a letter from the IRS telling him to report to the tax court in Washington, D.C. He wrote them back declining their invitation. Subsequent letters from the IRS were simply ignored. Grandma continued to worry. They returned to Texas in the fall of 1968, continuing their pattern of returning to Heaton in the spring of several in the spring for several years thereafter. Grandpa joined the John Birch Society for a short while. After 1972, the general dislike of the IRS became more pervasive and vocal in Texas. Meetings became more frequent to discuss the problem. Grandpa never spoke at any of them, but attended them all. All right, we will pick up in the next part at the top of page 30, and the title of the chapter will be Chapter 6, Posse.